Welcome to Preparing for AI with Matt Cartwright and Jimmy Rhodes, the podcast which investigates the effect of AI on jobs, one industry at a time. We dig deep into barriers to change, the coming backlash, and ideas for solutions and actions that individuals and groups can take. We're making it our mission to help you prepare for the human and social impacts of AI. The times, they are a-changing, everyone. Welcome back again to Preparing for AI, and this week with the 10th episode and our 2 millionth subscriber, we thought that we'd do an episode where we catch up on developments in AI. It's now been 2 months pretty much since we started this podcast, and I think as we've probably talked about on every single episode, the way that things have changed and the kind of pace and development of things is just so mind-blowing that even though this is not what we sort of plan to do as the main purpose of the podcast, we thought it would be good, particularly as we know quite a lot of you probably don't obsess about developments in AI as much as maybe we do, that we did an episode where we caught up on what has been happening and some of the kind of developments that might be interesting and important to our listeners. So Jimmy is back in the studio this week, although he's not actually here in the main studio with me, but in our sub-studio somewhere deep in Southeast Asia. So welcome back, Jimmy.
Hi, thanks. Welcome. Glad to be back. Yeah, I'm looking out over the rice fields in the south of China in Yunnan, actually in a place called, I'm probably going to butcher it, but Yuanyang, which is, it's like absolutely fantastic here. I've got a little bit of sunburn from yesterday, as you can probably see, if we're going to go out on video at some point. But yeah, good to be back.
So let's kick off. Let's maybe talk about models to start with, because that's kind of, I guess, the backbone of kind of AI at the moment. So I'll hand back over to you, Jimmy. I mean, let's just introduce, the latest developments, what's happening with the kind of large language models, and then we'll move on and go over all the other things that we'd be interested in and that we think that listeners might be interested in.
Yeah, so for me, the most exciting thing over the last couple of weeks, certainly, which may well change by the time people listen to this podcast, of course. But the most exciting thing for me has been the rise of the open source large language models. And so you've got the release of Llama 3. So actually Meta, formerly the parent company of Facebook, Meta have actually committed to open sourcing all their models, which is quite an interesting step where you compare with OpenAI, where it's in the name, but they're not actually that open and they don't open source their models. So a very recent announcement was that Llama 3 has just been released. And this was by Meta again, and they've released a 7 billion parameter, a 70 billion parameter, and they're soon to release a 400 billion parameter model. And the cool thing about this is so the 70 billion parameter model, for example, is about 400 times smaller than ChatGPT in terms of the size and the number of tokens. And I'm going to explain some of the things we're talking about in a moment. But yeah, it's about 400 times smaller, 400 times more efficient, 400 times cheaper to run, all this kind of stuff. But it's actually in between the performance of GPT-3.5, which is what's publicly available for free, and GPT-4, which is the paid for model. And things like Claude Opus and things like that. But it's actually as performant, like as good, and it's actually better than ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, even though it's about 400 times smaller. And the 7 billion parameter model, which I haven't had a go yet, but this is something that you can actually download and run on a laptop or something like that. And it would have to be quite a high-powered laptop with a good GPU, or a high-powered PC with a good GPU. But it's realistic to run it on consumer hardware. And that's really cool because it's actually getting comparable with performance of these kind of like, maybe it's the last generation model in terms of what you can pay for. But in terms of what's publicly available, you can get something that can do coding and things like that without having to be tied to using something like ChatGPT, where you either have to pay for it or you're giving them all your data, whatever it is. And so the implications of that are, businesses can potentially train these models on custom data and actually run them in-house without having to send their data to OpenAI or Google or someone like that, one of these big corporations. But also the really exciting thing is just how much more efficient these models are becoming, and how you're able to. We're already starting to see the possibility of running something on your local machine, a year down the line from ChatGPT 3.5 that's comparable in performance. And that's pretty exciting because, well, firstly, the kind of trajectory, like it's fairly exponential and things are improving all the time. But also, just like I was saying, like the fact that you can potentially run it on your own hardware and not have to rely on these huge tech companies, and the sort of direction that that's going in general for me is quite exciting.
It's probably worth touching on as well, even though we've maybe mentioned it on the podcast, but in terms of the sort of big models. So I think of, in terms of, I'd call them the big three, even though I think Meta in terms of a company obviously is bigger than Anthropic, but Claude, Gemini, and ChatGPT. For people who haven't listened, when we started this podcast 2 months ago, ChatGPT was definitely number one. Gemini had its problems, but then it was, being introduced. 1.5 Pro had all these kind of features that was going to be great. And then, Claude, Opus kind of came out of nowhere to take that slot. And I think you definitely at the moment, you're someone who is using Claude Opus. I've stuck with ChatGPT mainly because once you change over, if you subscribe for 2 or 3 months and you want to keep up, you end up just then halfway through that subscription changing back over. So I kind of stuck with ChatGPT. But I think at the moment, we're probably likely to see, if ChatGPT 4.5 or 5 comes out, definitely that will leap to number one. But we're probably going to see this kind of, moving. One company develops a new model and it's better than the other one, and that just carries on for, potentially a long period of time, because it's a bit of an arms race at the moment, isn't it? Everyone's just trying to stay ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're leapfrogging each other at the moment all the time, and you can keep changing your subscriptions. The exciting thing for me about Llama 3, and actually, so one of the things I've been doing is I've started using. So I've been doing a bit of coding work and things like that. I was using Claude Haiku actually, because Claude Haiku is really fast. So even though Claude Opus is
Faster,
like,
isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So Claude have got these three different models. It's a bit like you've got GPT 3.5 Turbo and you've got 4. You've got these different models you can use. Claude have Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus. They're called. The bottom, the sort of the least intelligent model is Claude Haiku, but it still has benefits in that it's super fast, like really quick. And Opus, which is the most intelligent model and the most going to give you ultimately the best answers, is actually pretty slow and can get quite jammed up during peak usage and things like that. So there are benefits. Like when I'm doing coding, if Claude Haiku can give me pretty good answers, I might do 90% of my workflow in Claude Haiku. And then when I get a bit closer, I'll just feed it all into Claude Opus, for example. And that then I can then use that to refine what I've been doing, because it can be a little bit slow otherwise. What I was going to get onto is like one of the really linking into the Llama 3 release last week or a few weeks ago. You can use Grok, and that's Grok with a Q, so GROQ. I'm spelling that out to distinguish it from Grok with a K, which is Twitter's, or formerly X, formerly Twitter's large language model, which is called Grok as well. So Grok with a Q, and I think we've talked about it on previous podcasts, but this is a site that you can go to, grok.com with a Q again, which you can pick from some of these models, some of these open source models. One of them is Llama 3. And Grok, they're designing their own chips, which are they're called language processing units, so as opposed to graphics processing units. And what they're doing is they're creating these custom chips that are going to be specifically used for large language models. And you can actually, and basically they run what's called inference a lot faster. So when you're talking to a large language model, what it does is inference. If it's running on a graphics processing unit, it's way, way, way slower than on these new custom chips that are language processing units. And if you go to grok.com, I think you can just log in for free. There's no sign up. There's no payment, anything like that. You can choose Llama 3 70 billion parameter, and it's so fast. It's even faster than Claude Haiku, which I previously mentioned. So for anyone who's kind of working with these models and having a play around with them, depending on what you're doing with them, because again, like if you want the ultimate kind of best response, you want to be using GPT-4 or Gemini 1.5 or Claude Opus. Claude Opus is probably the best right now, which you have to pay for. But if you're satisfied with a sort of slightly, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, like slightly less intelligent model, slightly, and we're only talking about something that 6 months ago was state of the art, then you can use these other models, which are much quicker and can give you 90%, 99% of the result, in my opinion, very quickly. And so actually I'm thinking about cancelling all my subscriptions and going with these kind of open source models for a little while and seeing how it goes.
It's probably worth us explaining at this point. So to give the example, if you use ChatGPT, so if you use ChatGPT-4 and you have the subscription, then it has integration with Bing search, so it can search for stuff that's on the internet that's up to date. Whereas the model itself is only trained until a cutoff point, which is I think April 2023. So if you're using Grok that Jimmy talks about, I mean, it is like insanely fast. It's unbelievably quick. The one thing to bear in mind is the information in there runs up to 2021. So if you're looking to do stuff where you need to do web search, then it's probably not the ideal way to do it. But it depends on your use. Even on ChatGPT, if you're doing something where you don't need web search and you're asking fairly basic things, you want it to summarize something for you. For example, 3.5 is going to be much, much better and much quicker most of the time. And I think using Grok in this example, for some things, it's going to be so fast. Once you use it, you'll never want to use anything else. However, it's looking at what you want to use it for. Google Gemini, I guess, has the advantage that it can use Google search. That's going to be the big thing for them if Google continues to be the best thing with search. But it's, what are you using it for? Because actually, if you're just using it for search queries, do you really need to use a large language model? I think when I've been speaking to people about it recently who don't use large language models very much, often what they seem to be using it for is searching for information. Well, how do I check that information's correct? And what I've tried to explain to them is, but if you're doing certain things, like if you want it to give you a piece of Excel code, for example, or you want to teach it a language, or you want it to, get a document and break it up into questions instead of a document so you can summarize it as questions or put into a PPT, you don't need to use the model that has a search function. And so I think for a lot of people, actually, my impression at the moment is they're not using large language models to the maximum advantage. They're almost using them in place of a search engine. And if you're doing that, then the open source model that only runs up to 2021 is not going to be useful if you're looking for, recent information. But if you're looking for it to tell you about the American Civil War, then it's absolutely fine because that happened before 2021.
No, 100%. And to be honest, while we're on the subject of in terms of what I personally use large language models for, again, like what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I actually find that so my having used them for about a year now, and having obviously followed the news and all the rest of it, and being somewhat of an expert in it, I actually don't like using large language models as a search engine, so to speak. I actually don't like asking them questions about facts and just sort of saying, what do you know about this? What do you know about that? Because that's where you get all these problems with hallucination. If they don't know the answer to the question or they're not sure about it, they'll just make stuff up. And this is what people talk about when they talk about hallucination. Now, if you want a bit of fiction and you want it to tell you a story, fine. Like, it'll do that, and it'll do that really well. What I prefer to do is have like specific use cases, and they're great at this. So I would say, like, when I say specific use cases, what I mean is feed into a large language model, I want to write an appraisal in this style. And this is all the information I need to feed into the appraisal. And, you still have to provide it with a lot of information, and you have to provide it with guidelines and almost guardrails of your own. If you do all that, it will spit out something that's really good. And obviously, it's something that contains facts, but they're facts that you've fed into it, and then it's regurgitating it back to you. The same thing with coding. Coding's something that's either right or wrong. But with all these things, I still feel like these models, they're not at the point where it's the expert. Like I'm a software developer, and when I work with a large language model to do coding, I just do it to make me quicker at coding. I'm still fact checking what it's giving me every single time, and I think we're definitely not at the point yet where you can't do that. It's like with the example I gave about writing some prose for you, writing an appraisal, writing a report, whatever. you still need to fact check it and check what's in there and probably feed it quite a lot of information. But it will save you a ton of time. If you wanted to get a large language model to write you for example, write you a challenge to court, like a small claims challenge, or a letter contesting some kind of parking charge or something like that, it'll spit that out really quickly. It'll do a great job of it. You probably still need to fact check it and feed in the dates when you parked, whatever it is. You'll need to feed a bunch of information into it, but it'll save you a ton of time just writing a wall of text. But these are for me, so my point is, these are the things where I think these models are really useful. They're really good at kind of rewriting, drafting, writing code, writing a first draft of something, all this kind of stuff, and working with you in that way and saving a bunch of time in that way. In terms of just asking a large language model, like you said, like a question about the Civil War or something like that, it might get the answer right, but there's probably better sources online where you can be sure that it's been fact checked.
Well, it's probably, to be honest, it's pulling a lot of it from Wikipedia and from sources you'd go to anyway. For those of you that listened to the episode we did with Anders Hove the other week, I started off by listing a load of potential uses of AI as an enabler of kind of climate goals. And he, as someone who had admitted to not being so much of an early adopter, had kind of looked up the same thing to research the show, but had just used the Google search. And we essentially came up with the exact 5 same things. So, maybe ChatGPT, I mean, I've taught ChatGPT a language that I use to summarize stuff. So for me now, it kind of does have an advantage to searching for certain kinds of information because I've taught it a language that allows me to do things really quickly. But for most people, it doesn't necessarily give you anything better. And I'm not saying that you don't use it for that. I'm just saying, that is not the main purpose of it. If you're using it for that, you're missing out on a lot, but also you maybe not even, you maybe not saving any time. And if you're paying for a model that has up-to-date search functionality, you're essentially paying for it to just do a search that you could do for free. I had a couple of points just I wanted to make. These are about sort of particular models. So one thing that we'll touch on a bit later and in future episodes is China, because we've been very much, I think, over most of the episodes focused on models coming out of the US. Obviously, we have Mistral that comes from France, but other than that, I think most of the things that people with any sort of beginner's interest in AI will have heard of are probably American Silicon Valley companies. But there's a lot of stuff happening in China. And Alibaba has a model called QN, which has a particular bit that I think is interesting, which is called QN Audio, which they call a symphony of sound and language. So this is marketed as not just being an audio processing tool, but it's actually, it calls it an auditory intelligence that speaks the language of sound with unparalleled fluency, which doesn't really tell you much. But basically, this model deals with human speech, music, the kind of subtleties of music, transforming audio to text, and it's focused on transforming that. Now, ChatGPT has something called Whisper as well, which is very similar. But this model from QN seems like it has the potential to really sort of redefine the way that's kind of interaction with machines using sound as a medium to form language. Because at the moment, most of the large language models, they're very good with text. Even this show is summarized. AI will create the transcript of this show, for example. It's not perfect. I think this new model is supposed to be very, very good. Now, it'll obviously be better in Chinese than English, but it just shows that there's a lot of stuff happening that maybe people are not aware of, where it's not only in the US that there's a big advantage. The other one was something that came about as we record this show in the last few days. So this ChatGPT-2, chatbot GPT-2, I think it's been called. And there was a kind of cryptic tweet by Sam Altman saying a soft spot for ChatGPT-2. So this model appears to be based on the architecture of GPT-4. There are rumors that it is 4.5. There are rumors that it's ChatGPT-5. It seems like it's not. It seems like it's not good enough to be that, but it potentially is a kind of new form of architecture which would allow ChatGPT style functionality in a much, much smaller model. So, in some ways similar to what Jimmy had talked about with this Llama model and with using Grok, where it's not necessarily that the only focus in development is about making more and more powerful models. It's actually making them smaller and allowing them to be something that, one, can be accessed quicker, Two, it's smaller, it's easier to store, it takes up less resource. And the big advantage, as we said, is that potentially these models can be, if they're open source, can be held on a local device. And that, is maybe the pathway to at some point having a large language model that is integrated on your phone instead of having to access the cloud all the time. I just thought first, Jimmy, if you want to finish off, but I had one question for you before we moved on, which was maybe just to explain for people in terms of open source and closed models, what the advantages of each one, because the way you've described it, why would anybody stick to a closed model? Why would they not use open source? Or is there still an advantage to the kind of closed source models for some people?
It's not so much that there's an advantage of closed source, but we're going to see the big developments in closed source. The biggest models are right now. The biggest models are closed source. So I spoke earlier on about the fact that Llama has a 7 billion parameter model, which, for reference, like I said, there's a 70 billion parameter model which you can't run on home equipment right now. There's a 400 billion parameter model which is going to be released soon, which you definitely can't run on home equipment. And there's I think so, ChatGPT version 4, it's not like it's actually not released how many parameters it has, but it's something like, it's over 1 trillion. It's something like 1.4 trillion, something like that. And so the reason why, and I think obviously we've got the sister podcast around sustainability, which we're going to talk about a bit more later on, but it partly comes into that, and it also partly comes into, if you want to run ChatGPT-4, the only way to run it is to run it through OpenAI, because they've got the big data centers where they've got enough GPUs and enough computing capacity to actually run these models. And it costs an absolute fortune. Talking to ChatGPT-4, it does cost a lot of money for OpenAI to run it, which is why they're charging. And they're not transparent about it, but I don't even know if they're making money with their $20 a month subscription that people are paying for. So the benefit of open source, like open source literally means, like, so the Llama model that's been released they're just releasing it into the public. So you can, in theory, you can download that model, that language model, and if you've got a powerful enough computer or a powerful enough data center, you can set up that model. You can also do fine tuning on it. So you can do your own tuning on your business data, for example. If you're a business, you could do fine tuning on it, and then you can run that completely locally. However, in terms of the state of the art right now, so the advantage is you can run it completely locally on your own data center, on your own computer, and you'll be able to have a chat with it like a chatbot, and it will give you output. And like I say, you can fine tune it. Fine tuning, well, I'll come back to fine tuning in a moment. In terms of closed source, then what you're doing is you're saying, let's just use OpenAI as an example for brevity, but what you're doing is that you're then saying to OpenAI, right, we've made an agreement. If you're a business, for example, you would sign up to an agreement probably where they're not going to share your data, or that use your data for like training future models, which is the business agreement they have, the business license. But when you're talking to it, you're sending your queries over the internet to OpenAI, who are running your query through GPT-4 in a massive data center, and then they're sending the response back to you. So I guess in terms of the limitations, you're reliant upon OpenAI and then maintaining that model. You're reliant upon their pricing, and they're continuing to honor that pricing and not increase that pricing every year, which most likely they will do in the future. You're reliant upon their existence, full stop. So, there's a whole bunch of benefits in terms of you're getting the latest model and the most powerful model and the most powerful inference, etc., etc. And you can still fine tune using GPT, like using OpenAI's models as well. So you can build your own fine tune models. But yeah, so the benefit is you get access to the latest and greatest, most powerful models. The downside is, you've then got a subscription. You're reliant upon this company. It's a third party, all the rest of it. So I guess it's a bit like cloud versus local in terms of storing your files, which obviously most people use cloud now because it makes much more sense. It's more, it just works out better for most companies these days. But you're still reliant upon this third party. The benefit of open source over that is you have full control over it. You can actually see you get full control over the model. You can decide when you want to upgrade, when you want to use the next model, whether you want to change it out, all the rest of it. So you probably get a level of control over it. I actually think it comes back to what we were talking about at the start of the episode, which is the more interesting thing right now is that we kind of don't know where the chips are going to lie in the future. And as you said at the start of the episode, Matt, it's kind of interesting that there was no way 12 months ago, there was no way you could run anything close to GPT 3.5 power at home. 12 months down the line, Llama 3 has been released. It's an open source model that you can actually run a version of on your own device, or certainly if you're a business on your own devices, which is actually comparable in performance to what was state of the art 12 months ago. So that's where it sort of differs from the cloud example, because with the cloud, you get efficiencies by storing things in the cloud and using a third party provider. I think with AI and with the way these large language models are evolving, we don't know where everything's going to land yet. And companies like OpenAI must be quite worried about the latest developments in terms of how much easier it's become to run these models. Because my feeling is there'll become a point where it's like, okay, GPT-5's out, but do I need GPT-5? Do I actually need it? Does it? It's 1% better than GPT-4 in terms of its coding ability. In terms of in terms of business applications, I wonder where it will get to the point where it's like, well, I could pay an extra $100 a month for GPT-5, but I don't really need it. And I feel like that's where these open source models are going, especially if you fine tune them for specific use cases. Like if you get a fine tuned coding model, for example, if it's got the performance that GPT-5 has anyway, then why would you need to pay for it?
Yeah, I mean we're not sort of talking about governance at this point, but I think one thing that's really important to say on the point you've just made is regulation in the EU's AI Act, and also rumors that I've heard from the US. I don't know what the name of this is, but that regulation is coming in July. So I mean, specific enough rumor to presumably know something is coming. And one of the things that will do is potentially restrict the size of open source models. So, that would give a huge advantage. And I'd imagine that some of the calls for regulation that the likes of Google and OpenAI have been asking for, part of that will be, well, you need to regulate, including, more regulation of open source models. And I think there's an argument for that, because you can say, well, it's dangerous. It's out there with, anybody having their hands on it. Anybody can do what they want with it. The other way to look at it is, well, okay, do you trust, a general person, or do you trust a big corporation? Because if you concentrate all of the power in those closed source models, then essentially you're saying a very small number of people or a very small number of organizations have all of the power and have all of the control. So, there's an argument both ways, I think, but I think regulation potentially has, there is the potential that regulation will mean that the open source models are not able to advance as much as they have, and that would obviously work to the advantage of the big Silicon Valley corporations.
Yeah, and I mean, just to clarify that point, I guess to take it right back to basics, why are they looking to regulate models of a certain size? What's the reason behind that? What's the misuse of large language models?
Yeah, so I don't fully know, although I'm probably ahead of you in terms of understanding of regulation. I'm not yet an expert in it, and I don't know what the specifics are. I wonder, as I said, whether the push from the big players is you need to regulate them more than us because it's dangerous. And I guess if you don't understand this, you would think, well, if we have it in the hands of a few organizations, it's easier for us to be able to control and have some degree of control over than it is if anybody out there has got access. If you look at the kind of coding and tech community, I think you get the opposite answer, that it's the exact opposite, and that open sourcing it makes it much, much safer because people can identify, you don't need a sort of red team just pre-release. You've constantly got that oversight and you've constantly got those checks and balances. So I don't know what the reason is for it. I would imagine to some degree at least, it's a misunderstanding of where the risk is, or it's a kind of overreach of, oh no, we haven't done anything. And one of the obvious things to think is the less players who we have with the capacity, the easier it will be for us to work with them and to control it. But that is my sort of speculative view. I don't know for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I mean is, like, just to take it right back to basics for people who are listening to the episode and they don't know why the regulations have been introduced. As far as I understand it, it's because these large language models, they can tell you anything, right? So they can tell you how to make a bomb. They can tell you how to do things that terrorists might want to do. They can tell you how to create potentially like biological agents. They, in the future, if as they get more advanced, they might even be able to create new biological agents that we wouldn't even, we haven't been able to come up with yet. So it's basically the problem of these models have been fed all of the information that's available, and they can tell you how to do like stuff that's illegal, basically.
Well, I think it's ChatGPT was asked. I presume this is as part of a kind of red team exercise. So red team, by the way, is pre-releases them kind of doing exercises to try and hack and try and do bad things to try and then put in place barriers. And the model came up with 400 potentially lethal pathogens, of which one was VX, which I think is the kind of most dangerous pathogen that we know of. And many of them were things that were unknown. So it definitely has the capability to do that. I think the argument against it is, you can look up how to make a bomb on the internet now, but you need the pieces to make it. So it's more of a question of, will AI allow you to understand what compounds you need, and then you can quite easily buy certain compounds if you're a lab, which don't necessarily need to be dangerous compounds on their own, and therefore there's a way in which you could create something. So without going into too much detail, there is a huge risk, but the risk is potentially not about the AI telling you how to do it, but more about if AIs get to a point that they're able to help to produce or source the things that you need. Because although it's difficult to Google search how to make a bomb, the information is there, and the dark web definitely has that information already available.
Yeah, and like, just to finish off on this, because I know we need to move on, but like, one of the I've been thinking about this, and one of the reasons why I think this is kind of BS is because they're talking about limiting the size or the complexity or the intelligence, whatever you want to call it, of open source large language models for this reason. And the reason I think it's kind of BS is because you can jailbreak the existing closed source models. So GPT-4, Gemini 1.5, Claude Opus, you can not only jailbreak them, but it's got to the point now where they've and you know more about this than I do, but they've now produced these global, are they called global jailbreaks? And I'll let you go into a bit more detail, but as I understand it, basically the point we're at is you can jailbreak these models, and not only that, there's global jailbreaks for these models, and the situation is that the companies who run these models, like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google, actually can't stop you from jailbreaking the models if you really want to. And the information on how to jailbreak them is out there and it's public and you can find it. And if you jailbreak the models, they'll tell you whatever you want. So my point being, we can go into global jailbreaks and all the rest of it if we want to. But my point being is, like, what's the point in like restricting the size of open source models if they can't even stop closed source models from spilling the beans on all the things we're talking about?
True. And you said we finish off on that. I'm just going to add one kind of last counterpoint to it, is almost that point that you've made plays into this idea that you should limit it, though, because if you acknowledge that at this point you can't stop it, and therefore I presume you're acknowledging that you need to find a way to stop it, then it is much more easy to do that if you're working with 3 organizations rather than you're working with everybody that's out there. Not necessarily where I stand on it, but I think that will be the sort of counter argument. And you're right. I mean, the jailbreak thing, when you look at it, and it's quite, I mean, you can YouTube video on jailbreak. It's quite scary to see how easily you can do it. I guess the mitigation, like I said, is that being able to jailbreak the model and get information out of it. Remember, it's trained on existing information as a large language model. So if you're asking it to do something, that information exists somewhere. there is a difference when it gets to the point that specific applications are able to, tell you how to fold proteins and tell you how to create compounds. Once you get to that point, then it becomes more and more dangerous. And then what can an AI do? Can it actually carry out that process? But I think, we're some way off that, but I think that's where the risk is. Should we move on then very quickly? I think just talk a bit about music generation, because it's something that obviously has been developed. I mean, it didn't really exist when we started this podcast 2 months ago, and then we use Suno to generate music at the end of each episode. I think at the moment, you can see AI music replacing kind of functional music, elevator music, that kind of thing, and in future, remixing your favorite songs, allowing you to do that. There's apparently already a trend at slowing up or speeding down your favorite track. There is a guy called Christopher Della Riva, who really, really interesting guy, who's a kind of, he's a music expert who also gets AI, someone that we hope to get on the pod later. He thinks it will settle as a way of generally enhancing music creation. Not sure I agree, but Jimmy, you've obviously been using this more than me. I mean, what's your feelings of where it is now, and where it's going to go in the short term?
Yeah. So as Matt says, listen to the end for our AI generated music content. I don't know if we released the lyrics or the links to the songs. They are, I would say they're pretty cheesy at the moment, and they're kind of like 1.5 to 2 minutes long, so they're not even full songs right now.
They sound like a Suno track, don't they?
Yeah,
like, they obviously sound like a Suno track. That's the thing. They've got this kind of style that is Suno's style, which you can tell.
Yeah,
I mean, the lyrics are they don't it's not the order. The lyrics don't kind of make sense. The way that they don't go quite right with the music, and I guess that's something that will change. But at the moment, I think you can almost tell, like, Suno tracks have their own style in the same way as a generated image at the moment has its own style.
Yeah, 100%. Like it's like you ask it to do a rock song, and it's like somehow it's kind of a mishmash of every rock song you've ever heard. It's the most generic rock song you could come up with, and as you say, the lyrics. Like it takes a few iterations. If anyone's had chance to actually have a go with Suno, you can kind of retry, and then eventually you come up with something that's like, okay, that's acceptable, and that's kind of how we create the songs for the end of the podcast. I think it's another one of those things where it's like, if you look at it in isolation, it's like, okay, it's not gonna replace people, it's not gonna replace jobs, it's not gonna replace music, but this is kind of like Suno version 2, which, Suno version, or is it Suno version 3? I can't actually remember. The point is, like, Suno version 1 was less than a year ago. It's now on version 2 or 3. What's version 4 going to look like? Is that going to be full length songs with, an improvement over what we've got right now, and more diversity in the music and that kind of stuff? It's a sort of direction of travel, which again is kind of exponential. And one of the things that a few people have mentioned, just talking on music generation, is that there seems to be, and this is like not an accusation, it's I guess just a kind of amusing, which may not end up being included in the podcast, but there seems to be a lot of stuff on Spotify these days where you've got a song which doesn't really have an artist behind it, or it's got an artist that's got no history, that's got nothing behind them. And they sound very much like AI generated music. And given that anyone can put music on things like Spotify, and I'm picking on Spotify, but other kind of platforms as well, you have the same kind of anyone can put music on those platforms in the same way as you can on YouTube and things like that. And so, is this stuff creeping into Spotify and things like that already? Like, have you got people who are just generating AI generated music and putting it onto Spotify and other music platforms? I think it's one maybe for the comments. I'd like to hear from people on what they think on this, because it's something that's come up a few times.
I can probably answer your question. I found an article in Chinese on a Chinese social media app which basically told you how you could make around $1,500 a month by doing exactly what you've just said, basically producing AI music, and it told you how to, market it to enough people to access it. I think it's something that obviously is not going to last for long, because either it will be saturated or, I would imagine the likes of Spotify will shut it down if it starts to, flood Spotify to the point that the algorithm is feeding people rubbish AI tracks. So I think it will probably not last for that long, but I think at the moment, and do comment if people feel otherwise, but it seems like there are not only people doing it, but there are people telling other people how to make money by doing it. So it's definitely happening at the moment. What about stable audio? I think you've used that as well. Is that better, worse?
Stable audio right now. So I had a play around with it. I wouldn't say it's as good as Suno. It seemed to be. So first of all, Suno will come up with lyrics for you. So you can just type in, I want a song about this. You just type a short description and you say in whatever style you want it in. Stable audio, I did have a little play around with it. It generates okay tracks, but they're even shorter in length. And although you can sort of adjust the length of the tracks, and it won't generate lyrics for you, so you would probably need to work with something like Claude or another AI if you wanted to generate AI generated lyrics. So I would say stable audio is not there yet, but it's another product you can use. Like if you want to generate music, one of the benefits of stable audio is it seems like you can actually tweak a bunch of parameters, whereas Suno is just you give it a prompt, including what style you want it in and want the music in, and then it just generates stuff, and then you're either happy with it or you're not. Stable audio does seem to have more parameters that you can adjust and play around with. You can feed in your own lyrics and all the rest of it. So they both have use cases, but my feeling, if you want to just generate some music quickly on a topic of your choice, Suno's definitely the easier one to use.
I talked a little bit in the first section about China when I talked about Alibaba's QWEN model. At some point we definitely want to have an episode about China, just to try and introduce different apps, different uses, different LLMs. But I think just as a kind of overview of the stuff that I've seen at the moment, I think robots is the thing where China is definitely ahead, particularly in terms of scale. Like they're manufacturing robots and starting to use robots much more than anywhere else. Baidu recently released some AI tools in addition to their Ernie bot, which allows sort of non-programmers to develop generative AI-powered chatbots for particular uses. And this is a bit different from the custom chat GPTs because they can be integrated into websites and to Baidu search engine results. So Baidu is essentially China's answer to Google, although nowhere near as usable, or kind of other online portals. But the other thing they've got, so Walker S robots, which people who are interested in robots may have heard of. They're from a company called UB Tech. They've chosen to use Baidu as essentially the large language model to power their robots. In the way we talked about the what was it, OpenAI was with, what was the company called? It was doing the OpenAI powered Figure AI. Yeah,
Figure
that's
AI,
right.
yeah.
And apparently Apple. So this won't be for outside of China, obviously, but in China are potentially going to use Baidu for their future AI release, whatever that looks like for iPhones and Macs, etc. So there's a lot of stuff happening that people are not aware of. The other one, the kind of one that caught my eye recently, is Vidu, VIDU. So that was released recently. It's essentially being marketed as China's Sora. I think it looks better, actually. I think the images look, I don't know how to explain it. I think people just look it up, have a look at Vidu. Maybe they're more Asian and they have a different kind of style to them. From what I saw of it, I thought it looked potentially better than Sora. It's obviously going to be a similar technology. Apparently it's better at creating things like dragons. So I think there is a kind of cultural thing in there of what it will produce. But I'd suggest people look it up, because if your mind was blown by Sora, it will be equally blown away by Vidu, VIDU. And that's the sort of big one that I've seen in the last couple of weeks, which strangely doesn't seem to have really picked up as much media attention as I'd have thought of. But maybe, like I say, that's just because the focus is on the kind of big three in Silicon Valley. I don't know if you want to add anything on there, Jimmy, on sort of China at this point.
No, I haven't had a chance to check out Vidu yet, though, and I will check it out. One of the things that people said about Sora is that, and I think this is borne out by the way it was trained, is that a lot of it looks like it was made in a game engine, even though what you're looking at is photorealistic. And one of the things that was, I think it's speculated, maybe confirmed at the moment, is that obviously NVIDIA produce graphic chips and they've got all these virtual environments. And then you've got things like Unreal Engine 5, which can produce these kind of very lifelike environments. And the speculation is that Sora has been trained on a lot of artificial data from things like Unreal Engine 5, because that, and then what you end up with out of Sora is this kind of, it looks like some of those cameras and the footage look like they're game engine footage a little bit, in terms of the way the camera moves, rather than in terms of the way the camera angles and the way the camera moves, rather than the actual footage itself. The footage is AI generated and very lifelike and photorealistic, but some of the movement of the camera and some of the scenes and things like that look like they come out of some sort of game engine a little bit.
We talked a few weeks ago on, I think, the translation episode about the rise of agents, but maybe not everybody has listened to that episode. So that's obviously been a big development in the last few weeks. So I'm going to ask you, Jimmy, less so to describe the developments, but to explain to people what agents are and why they're going to change people's lives. And I mean that not in a hyperbolic way, but in terms of how these are things that in most people's jobs, for example, they'll actually be able to use these to make a difference if they still have a job.
So agents, the difference with agents and some of the agents that are starting to come out is what they'll enable you to do is actually carry out actions in the real world using a large language model to understand the world. And what I mean by that is, so an example of an agent is something that takes in information on what you're doing on your browser, for example, in your email, in your shopping cart, something like that, feeds it into a large language model along with your request. So you might say, okay, I want to go to Amazon and buy a gift for my 5-year-old nephew. And with as vague a description of that, these agents can go and send that information to something like ChatGPT. ChatGPT will figure out, how you would go through that process. And the agent feeds into additional information to ChatGPT, like, I'm using a browser, I've got access to these shopping sites, I'm logged into these sites, whatever it is. And then, given that information, the large language model can send some instructions back that say, okay, and the agent acts as an in-between to decipher it, to say, okay, go to Amazon.com, search for whatever the search criteria is, gifts for a 5-year-old boy, something like that. And then it can provide you a bunch of suggestions. And then instead of clicking on something on Amazon, you just say to the agent, okay, I want to buy this. And it will then go and take all the actions it needs to take to buy something. Now, it's quite a simple example, but what you're actually doing there is you're enabling large language models in the background to carry out real-world interactions on your behalf. And that's kind of the critical thing with agents. So when you take that into a business environment, it then takes it from being, okay, I'm a software developer, as an example again. I'm going to go and speak to ChatGPT and ask for some code to do this X, Y, and Z. And then I'm going to copy and paste that code into my code browser or code editor. And then I'm going to run that code and test that code and all the rest of it. As you move towards agents, instead of doing that, you just say, I want to write some software to create, let's just use a simple example. So, an example that I've seen online. So, I want to create some software to create an online checkout for my website. And then what you have is you have a series of 3 or 4 different agents that can all work as a sort of little development team, where one is the developer, one is the kind of CEO who's handing out instructions, one is the tester, etc., etc. And they all basically can work with a large language model in the background to carry out their tasks, but then actually execute their tasks. So actually, instead of you having to copy and paste code into the code editor, they'll go and do that for you, and then the tester will test it for you, etc., etc. And so these agents are mechanisms. They're kind of like they're the in between, the go between large language models and actually being able to carry out real world actions, and all of that in the context of jobs, which is part of this podcast. All of that can sound quite scary in terms of like this is in terms of the mechanism of actually replacing jobs. This is agents are part of the path to that, because they then take out the man in the loop in a sense.
And the focus is definitely on kind of enterprise. That's where the money's going to be. I would suggest that people, if they are interested in this, that they watch the Google presentation where they announced it from I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I think they give a really good example of kind of 5 or 6 uses and different ways in which, or different kinds of agent that will come out. And I think that the idea is that will come out this year. I think you're probably looking at autumn this year. So if you're interested in that part in particular, then suggest a bit more reading or watching the presentation, which you can find on YouTube or Google's own website.
I was just going to say another like really quick real world example, which brings together a few things we've talked about on this podcast. So Grok with a Q that we were talking about earlier on, which has the ability to do inference in almost real time, combined with things like Whisper, which can translate voice to text and back again, combined with something like GPT-4 and these new agentic models, means that things like automated call centers where you can't really distinguish them from a person are just around the corner, because you've got 4 pieces there which allow you to have real-time conversation that sounds human-like and you can't really distinguish from a real human, that can interact with something like a large language model to actually understand what you want and what you're talking about properly, and again like do that in real time. And so that's kind of an application that's just around the corner and fits into this category of agent.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call them physical kind of AI devices. So this is not robotics, but this is, and we mentioned briefly on the translation episode, something called the AI pin, which has been absolutely slated in terms of all the reviews that it's had so far. And I think it's worth saying that if you look at it on any of the videos, you kind of would question, well, what's the point of this thing? It's essentially supposed to be, an AI large language model in a physical device, but it's not in the physical device. It's still based on the cloud and needs a subscription. So the immediate question you ask is, well, why don't I just have a large language model on my phone? The argument against having a phone is, well, then you have a screen, you have to look at it. This, you can talk to it. You can then argue again, well, I can just talk to my phone. There is an argument that I think is quite interesting around reducing screen time. And if we're going to have more digital interaction, do we at some point want to stop looking at screens all the time? I think that is a very good argument. I'm not sure this is the way to do it. But if you look at these kind of devices, I think at the moment, Rabbit R1 is another one. Asio Humanizer apparently is another one, which I haven't heard anything about, but apparently exists. I think it's not what these models are now, but it's looking at the fact that, do you end up with something like, from Star Trek, basically, or are you able to have literally in your watch or in a literal pin, at some point, a locally held large language model that you can just talk to? And one of the really interesting things I think the AI pin does do is when you land in a different country, it identifies that country and then it will change its settings. So if you were landing in Brazil, it would know you're somewhere Portuguese, and then it would expect people to speak Portuguese. So it could then act as a translator for you. Again, why couldn't a phone do that? Why couldn't a large language model on a phone do that? I don't think this iteration is that interesting, but the fact that it exists and the fact that I think you can see where that's going to lead to. I also think you can probably look at, okay, wait until that is integrated with a phone. What are Apple going to do this year? What are they going to announce in June? Maybe they're not going to have a large language model held locally on a phone at this point, but at some point, I think you look at that and combine it with the idea of your existing devices. It's pretty exciting to think that at some point you're going to have something small enough to be on a phone.
On the one hand, it sounds really cool. I'd quite like to try one myself, especially for the translation thing. Like if I could use it for genuinely use something for real time.
These got quite a long delay, which is one of the problems with it. Is if the idea, and we talked about this on translation episode, of instantaneous translation would be amazing, but then you'd need to have it locally held. As long as you've got a subscription on the cloud and you have a delay, yes, it's useful for someone who's on holiday, but it can't replace a translator. If it can do it instantly, it can, in many circumstances, replace a translator. That's why we're saying, at the moment, being a cloud-based model, for me, it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, and I've got Microsoft Translator on my device at the moment, and I've used it in China, and it's basically you press a button and you talk, and then it translates, and then vice versa. It like that capability is already there. So for me, it has to be that kind of Star Trek universal translator type thing for it to be actually exciting, not just a pin that can talk to you. Like, again, like as you say, for me at the moment, it's like, well, what's the difference in that and having a phone that has a connection to a large language model? Because that's all it's really doing. It's kind of acting as a middle device there. That being said, if it realizes it's kind of like final form, and the final form is real-time translation and a bunch of other stuff, that means, instead of having to go into your Uber app and order an Uber, you can just basically press the button and say, I need an Uber to blah, blah, blah. That would probably start to feel quite natural. I can imagine these things in their final form. Like I say, I can imagine them being pretty cool. Where instead of like having to go into all these different apps on your phone, which the Rabbit R one, I think, they talk about that in their promo videos, is like, imagine not having to have all these hundreds of apps that do all these different things. You just have the one thing that you can just talk to, and it just does whatever you want. A lot of the things you do with apps on your phone is just to like get to an end purpose, right?
But which is why, if at some point in the future a version of the AI pin can replace a phone and you can not have to have screen time because you can do everything by speech, then that's a different matter. But at the moment, what you've got is, I'm going to have my phone and my smartwatch and my laptop, and then I'm going to have the AI pin as well, and it's another device on top of it. I do like the idea of getting rid of a screen for some things, so that you're not watching videos on your phone, and you're not, it's not good for anybody to be staring at a rectangle that small for so many hours a day. So if you can reduce screen time, it's a great idea. But at the moment, what we're talking about is an additional device, and that's not what I think people want. It's integrating it. And if in the future we can replace screens some of the time, then that would be a nice sort of side effect of it. But I think we're a way off. But it's still interesting. I mean, I'd again suggest if people are interested in this, look up the AI pin. I mean, it's kind of cool. It just feels like something that you'd go and look at an exhibition and be like, oh, that's really cool. I can't wait for 3 years' time when a version that actually does something useful comes out. But you can see the future. So let's finish this episode, because we are a podcast that primarily is about the impact on jobs and people, by looking at jobs and looking at what's been happening. I think it's clear that actual job losses that are credited to AI, there's not many of them. I think the actual ones seem to be in tech and customer services as well. I think customer services, you can see that it's happening there. Tesla is a good example of a tech firm where there's been articles about how they are, they're cutting positions, even though they're an organization. Okay, they've encountered some difficulties, but they're a massive, organization with a huge value. So it's not that struggling organizations are cutting jobs. It's potentially organizations that are still doing well, but are seeing productivity advantages. But as we've said in the first few episodes, this is about stealth. It's about slow losses. Is also, I think, and this is something I found myself from my own kind of research and stuff, something that I'm going to call phantom jobs. And what that is people leaving jobs and then the job being advertised, and you see the same job on LinkedIn and it's been going around for 5-6 months, and you think, how have they still not filled that job? And then you realize that when you speak to people in organizations, they say, well, we were told the job was advertised, but then we're told, economy, end of year, blah, 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 funding. Oh, we'll see how we can get on with 7 in the team instead of 8. And then as time rolls on, actually it works okay because we see some productivity gains. And then, we don't need that position anymore. And that is, I don't know to what scale, but it's definitely happening. There are a lot of jobs out there advertised at the moment and they're never being filled. And, the talk of, well, there's a shortage of people. There's a lot of people who are looking for jobs who are, pretty skilled and are not finding them and are applying for jobs and not hearing back. And I think that is something we're seeing. It may not, again, be completely down to AI. Maybe organizations are looking at the economy and saying we need to hold fire. But I think we can definitely put part of it down to AI and, organizations where CEOs are acknowledging that they're taking a bit of a wait and see approach. If they're going to see a massive productivity gain later this year, then why fill those positions when, I'll have to cut somebody later? I think that's another thing that definitely seems to be happening.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's tons of examples where it seems to be just, the tech industry slowing down, like the current economy, state of the economy, that kind of thing, used as the excuse. We've talked about it on previous episodes where there's definitely an element where there's a wait and see approach, and and then maybe there's some AI efficiencies creeping in. I've also got quite a recent, I think it's been happening for a little while, but I saw a YouTube video recently about an example of AI powered fast food ordering. So there's a company called Presto, and Arby's in the US have already rolled out these Presto machines, a bunch of locations across the US. And I'm sure there's going to be other fast food like restaurants, McDonald's, all the rest of it, keeping a close eye on this. But effectively what this is when you drive through a drive-through now, instead of ordering from a human, you order from an AI. And they have these boxes, these Presto boxes, which basically ask for your order and what do you want to order, and then they'll try and do the upsell for you. And ultimately, if you can't complete your order through the AI, they might pass you on to a human. Now, they're not fully replacing jobs yet, as in they're just probably replacing part of someone's time because someone's having to keep an eye on the AI right now, in a similar manner to sort of the automated checkouts and things like that. But it's an interesting development where it's a concrete example where you're already able to start ordering your fast food using an AI, and it is, in this case, it's based on a large language model. So it's using that text to speech and speech back to text again, and using a large language model in the background, kind of similar to what I talked about earlier on in terms of like the call center example. 100%, if you haven't heard of it, it's something to have a look at. It's definitely replacing part of someone's job right now in all these Arby's where they're testing it. I would imagine you're going to really quickly start to see these in all your other fast food chains.
Yeah, it's definitely happening. And as we've talked about, the sort of scale of it and the speed of it is probably less so than, maybe people feared, but it's still very, very early days. And we're starting to see concrete examples, although, I still don't think there's going to be a big announcement. No one's going to put it down to AI at the moment because, there is already enough fear, particularly, and this is something that's really interesting. There's a lot of research on this, and I don't have a source to quote at this point, but there is far more excitement in developing countries. I hate that term, developing countries, but developing countries, developing economies around AI than there is in some of, the more liberal Western countries where there's a lot more existential dread and fear for jobs, and that's borne out. I mean, there is some research that showed the difference just in a year in the US between the number of people who were optimistic, were sort of, it was a wash. They were neither optimistic or pessimistic, or were pessimistic about AI, and it had rocketed up in a year the number of people who were pessimistic. So, it's having an effect, even though it doesn't seem to be played out in sort of, I mean, there's a lot of media articles, but it doesn't seem to be an issue that is affecting elections as I can see it at the moment. The other example I've got, and I think I've made this one before, whether you want to call it long COVID or long jab, whether you put it down to vaccine or you put it down to the infection, it's definitely a fact that there are a lot of people who are being taken out of the workforce. In the US, I think it's about 4 million people. In the UK, it's about 700,000 since the beginning of the pandemic who've left the workforce. Now, that may not continue at that rate. It may speed up, it may drop down. But I think that gives a great excuse for organizations, as a lot of people, leave the workforce or retire early, and therefore you don't need to fill them. There seem to be plenty of reasons in the world at the moment for people to leave the workforce that allow organizations to cut positions without having to cut people. And I really think that is something to watch, because, that pace, there was another fact from an ONS survey in the UK that was rates of long COVID between March 2023 and 2024, and an increase of 0.4% of the population. Now, if you took 0.4% of the population out of work every year for a few years, that would nicely help with the transition of getting rid of people and replacing them with AI and machines. So, call me a cynic or a conspiracy theorist, but I certainly think there is something in there. Many ways, like I said, that companies are able to cut positions without actually getting rid of people or making them redundant.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's something to keep an eye on. I don't know necessarily what you can do about it, other than some of the things we talked about before. I think, I think as we start to see more concrete examples, it will, okay. I feel like it's able to fly under the radar a bit at the moment, but I feel like it is building, and as it starts to impact jobs more, it's going to become much harder for it to fly under the radar. And interestingly, I don't know if we talked about this on a previous episode, but we were offline. We were talking about a bill that the UK had released around AI and like how it can be used in the workplace. I think you know more about this than me, and I don't know if we talked about it on a previous podcast.
Yeah, so what I think you're talking about, Jimmy, that I shared an article with you, that was actually from a trade union, and as a sort of proposal for a bill that they wanted to put in place, which was aimed at protecting people's rights. Now, kind of cynically, it also was protecting, the use of a trade union. But some of the things that they were asking to be put into law would, limit the kind of things that could be replaced by AI, would limit this, I think would help with the speed of it. And they wanted that to be something that was kind of put into a kind of protection of rights from AI legislation. Now, whether that's ever going to be considered in that guise, I would think at some point, all the trade unions are going to have to do something similar, and maybe they all get together and put something in place. We talked in previous episodes about the kind of industries that unionize, and maybe that will help slow things down. But it is interesting to see that in the UK, which is not really a particularly it's not a heavily unionized country, but the unions are starting to make noises. How successful they are, I don't know. So maybe to end the episode, I just wanted to give one other example. So Google, IBM, Indeed, Eightfold, Accenture, Intel, Microsoft, and SAP, along with 6 advisors, have formed this thing called the AI-enabled Information and Communication Technology Workforce Consortium, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's led by Cisco, and it aims apparently to help individuals whose roles have been displaced in the tech industry by training them for new opportunities. So this is about, affecting employees to upskill, reskill, find them training programs and things that are able to help them transition in the labor market. I kind of see this as trying to get out ahead of regulation. And I think this is the reason I think this is really interesting. I think this shows that organizations and industries know that regulation is coming. The Premier League in football is trying to put a salary cap in place at the moment. And I think that the thinking is they're trying to get ahead of an independent regulator. So I think, this is a good piece of news in a way. I'm quite cynical about the reason for it, but I think what it shows is that, regulation is coming. The issue of jobs it's definite. I mean, we said since we started this podcast because we thought not that many people were really focused on jobs. And then, there are more and more articles coming out. There is more and more interest in it. There are more and more people who are worried about their jobs. And the fact that organizations are like that are getting together and finding ways to try and help their workers, great as it is, the cynic in me says that shows that they know that regulation is coming, and getting out ahead of that is potentially going to help them. So I guess it's good and bad news. But it's, if nothing else, it's proof that, the change is coming, and those in the know, they're already doing something to get ahead on it. So I think that's maybe a good way to finish. I know, Jimmy, I don't know if you want any last thoughts on jobs before we finish off.
No, I agree. I think since we started this podcast, which isn't that long ago, but it seems to be there's more and more talk of regulation, what the effect's going to be on jobs. So, and how AI is starting to be introduced into the workplace in general, and the kind of the backlash around that, all the things we're talking about on the podcast. So I totally agree. Our podcast is pretty topical right now. I think that it's going to continue to trend that way. And I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think it's going to become, my feeling is it's going to become more and more difficult to hide the fact that AI is impacting jobs and roles. And so it's going to just become a bigger and bigger topic that we can continue to explore on the podcast.
Okay, so let's call it a wrap on today's episode. That has been really interesting for me to just kind of talk that things back and forth that we've been kind of exchanging messages about for a while. I hope that's interesting. It is not, we don't want to be a podcast that just talks about developments and the latest news, but I think, like I said, so much has happened that it's worth us kind of bringing ourselves up to date before we get stuck into potentially some more industries in the weeks ahead. So thanks a lot for listening. Just another call out, please, people, if you enjoy the show, please do subscribe to it so you get it downloaded automatically. The more subscribers we get, the more people that download, the easier it is for us to get more interesting and higher profile people to speak on the podcast and to join us for interviews. So thanks everyone for your support, and we will see you next week for another episode. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
I'm flipping the script, let me spit around about the open source AI models with prime time shine. They coming up quick, closing in on the tech giants. Better watch your step, y'all, cause we ain't staying silent. Big tech think they slick, but they better beware. Open source AI models bringing innovation to the air. We breaking barriers, leveling the playing field. No fancy commercials, just real skills revealed. We open up the source, let the knowledge flow. AI models for the people, it's time to let them know. Big tech got they stock, but we got the heart, and with creativity on our side, we gon' tear them apart. It's on my walk part. We open up the source, let the knowledge flow. AI models for the people, it's time to let them know. Big tech got their stock, but we got the heart, and with creativity on our side, we gon' tear them apart.